workshop. This session today will focus on using drones for conducting species and wildlife management. Welcome back to those of you who have joined us in previous sessions. And if today is your first session with us, you are in for a great series of presentations and discussions. Today's virtual session is being recorded and will be shared on the workshop website, which is at the bottom of the slide that you're looking at now, and I'm also going to type it into our chat box here. Do take a moment to participate in our icebreaker when it comes back around. And let's get started. I do want to take a quick moment to thank organizations and individuals who have made this virtual webinar series possible. For those who have been with us since the start, this workshop was originally a 2-day in-person workshop that has transitioned into a series of virtual webinars. And we'd like to thank our sponsors, the Southeastern Caribbean Regional Collaboration Team, the Southeast Coastal Ocean Observing Regional Association, the Caribbean Regional Association for Coastal Ocean Observing, the Duke University Marine Robotics and Remote Sensing Lab, the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science, the Integrated Ocean Observing System, and the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. I'd also like to give a huge thank you to our entire planning team. It's been wonderful watching this transition into a virtual webinar series. Kudos to Chris Taylor, Stephanie Robinson, and John McComb with NOAA. Also, thank you, Chris, for co-hosting and timekeeping today. I'd also like to thank Abby Wakely and Deborah Hernandez with Socorro, Dave Johnston and Justin Ridge with Duke University, Whitney Jenkins from the North Carolina National Estuarine Research Reserve, and Scott Eastman from the GTM National Estuarine Research Reserve. And my name is Caitlin Dietz, and I'm located at the GTM Research. And thank you for everyone, to everyone for participating in our icebreaker this morning. Our icebreaker is up on the screen now, and you're still welcome to participate in it. The question is, it's fill in the blank. The last time I flew a drone, I ... And it's been fun watching some of the responses come in. I will go ahead and admit that the first time, or the last time that I flew a drone, I actually flew it into a tree and have not flown a drone since then. I see there are some other drone users who have had similar previous flights as mine, including hitting the cat. And we also have some folks, the last time that they flew a drone, they must have been dreaming because maybe it was so long ago. I see a missed pterodactyl, so I'm glad that you missed that one. And then some of you have shared some actual productive last flights. Some surveying of marsh vegetation, which is always good to hear. I also see surveying a flood-damaged forest in the Missouri River Valley. Thank you for sharing that. I also see some troubleshooting. So there's a good background of previous flights that we can all share with each other. So thank you for participating, and you are welcome to continue sharing. I am going to go ahead and review today's agenda. We have 4 wonderful lightning presentations today from 5 great presenters, with time after the presentations for questions and answers. So please just hold those questions or type them into the chat box, and after the presentations we'll review those. Also, presenters are encouraged to type responses to those questions in the chat box as they come up. After those presentations and question and answer session, we will have a quick break. And then we are going to move everyone into breakout rooms to discuss challenges and opportunities of using drones for species and wildlife management. And today's session will wrap up by noon. All right, So let's go ahead and transition into our lightning talks. We will go through the presentations and have time for questions and answers afterwards. As your questions come to you, please go ahead and submit them into the chat box. Our first lightning talk today is about monitoring and ecological aspects of the Antillean manatee in Hobos Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, and it'll be from Dr. Milton Muniz. Milton Muniz is a biologist and chemical oceanographer who graduated from the National University of Columbia and the University of Puerto Rico. He is the stewardship coordinator of the Hobos Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve and has been for the past 5 years. And today he's going to share with us the main findings of a manatee monitoring project in Hobos Bay. So Milton, you should be able to advance the slides. And
hello everybody, can you hear me?
Yes.
It's a real pleasure to present you the main findings of this study, monitoring and ecological aspects of the Antillean manatee, Trichechus manatus, in Hobos Bay, Puerto Rico. Manatees belong to the order Sirenia and are represented by two families, Dugongidae and Trichechidae. This one has one genus, Trichechus, and 3 different species. And the Caribbean or West Indian manatee, it has 2 subspecies, Trichechus manatus for Puerto Rico and Trichechus manatus latirostris found in Florida. Hobos Bay is the second largest estuarine area in the island and is one of the main habitats for these endangered species. The study area was set in that blue polygon that is close to our boat ramp, and we set these basically for main objectives: determine the presence of manatee in that part of the bay, recognize that main habitat range used, identify or recognize individuals under the water conditions of Hobos Bay, and collect information about behavior. About the methodology, we use a commercial drone, DJI Mavic Pro Platinum, and we perform early flights for 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. just to have better visibility, less wind speed, less sun glint. We performed some aleatory flights in that study area. Once a manatee was spotted, we took photographs to record the coordinates, and we record videos of the sightings. About the results of analysis, we found we have 48 days of sampling from October 2018 to February 2020. In total, we spotted 136 manatees. Only during 2 days we were not able to see manatees, but were more due to severe weather conditions. 7 was the higher number of manatees spotted, and with an average of 3 manatees per sampling days. We were able to identify 20 individuals, 8 couples, mothers and calves, some adults, juveniles, and individuals with both scars. These images summarize the main activities of the manatees in the bay. Basically, feeding was the predominant activity that the manatees do in that area. That image in the upper right is a calf breastfeeding from its mother. This image summarizes the spatial distribution. The red dots are the opportunistic sightings recorded by boat from 2011 to 2015, basically during the swamp field trips, against the purple dots that are the sightings collected during this study. I created this photo identification catalog based on crop images from the videos, and the principle was basically looking for particular characteristics in this case from non-permanent marks as the presence of barnacles, or scars as permanent marks. In this case, a scar on the right shoulder of in that baby. Or missing part of the body, this one that could be probably due by a boat propeller. Or another characteristic body pigmentation as that white mark or black coloration on the face in the other individuals. In this image, you can just see the difference between the body pattern pigmentation between mothers and calves. And we were able to see some interaction between some of the individuals. In this case, we have these two babies that were basically chasing, interacting in between, and we can interpret that behavior as a kind of social display or play. We were able to identify a particular place in that part of the bay where manatees usually gather on a regular basis, and this could be a potential source for fresh water outcrop from inside the bay.
Milton, you have 1 minute left.
I analyzed the footage that I took during this study, and I measured the respiratory rates, and basically go from just a few seconds up to 6 minutes, a little more than 6 minutes. 75% are in the range of 30 seconds to 2 minutes and 15 seconds. And there were no significant difference between the respiratory rates of the adults in blue and the calves in orange. And actually, the highest respiratory rate is from a calf. In conclusion, using this technology is very useful for monitoring manatees in this part of the bay. And this is an important area for resting, feeding, and area of refuge, and also as a possible area of source of fresh water. And this part of the bay, in general, Hobos Bay is an important area that that can be used for reproduction for these species. And manatees in the wild can be photo identified and recognized through these images. And monitoring is a great tool to learn a little more about the behavior of these species. Thank you, Terry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Milton. Those are great examples of how you use drones. Our second lightning talk is from Dr. Michelle Sharrow, and the talk is going to be about using UAS for weighing populations, and it's a case study across gray seal lactation. Michelle is a tenure track assistant scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution's biology department, where they are studying the physiological ecology of marine mammals. The Sharrow Lab focuses on the linkages between energy balance and physiological condition, behavior, and reproductive success of marine mammals. The lab takes an integrative approach using a diverse tool set, such as drones, to assess the processes driving intra- and interspecific variation in marine mammal life history cycles. So Michelle, I'm going to pass the baton over to you.
Great. Thank you, guys. I'm really excited to talk today about how we've been using drones for 3D modeling of marine mammals to estimate their masses and weigh populations. So top predators such as pinnipeds act as ecosystem sentinels, as animal size and mass reflect the animal's net energetic costs versus gains. And pinnipeds also reliably haul out on shore for pupping each year, and this is accompanied by really dramatic female-to-pup mass transfer over a very short lactation period. So here we see the mothers are losing about 30% of their body mass, while pups are doubling or tripling in size across a short 15 to 18-day lactation period in gray seals. And while these proxies such as mass and fat stores are very useful indices of ecosystem health, they're often very challenging to collect. And so obtaining these measures beyond just a few individual animals starts to become unwieldy pretty quickly. So there's a distinct lack of methodology to understand how organismal level processes translate to energy dynamics population-wide. And to address these issues, there's been a great deal of work trying to use photogrammetry to measure animal size, and so this circumvents some of the logistical challenges such as sedating the animals, having to physically weigh them. Most of this work comes from photographing the animals on the ground for 3D rendering, but this does require that somebody walk up to the animal to put an object of known size in the frames to get a sense of scale. And people also started using drones, mostly to take relatively simple 2D measurements of the animals. And of course, because we know altitude of the drone, we can get at pixel size and size of the animals. So we began using the drones to 3D model large groups of animals using a structure for motion approach. We've done this over the past 2 years with gray seals in Nova Scotia throughout the month of January in Canada. And we used a multi-rotor, the FreeFly Alta 6, to take photographs 360 degrees around groups of seals. And then we stitched the images back together for an orthomosaic, a digital surface model showing relative elevation, and each point there is a seal. And then from differences in elevation, we can measure the total body volume of the seals. So we did this in Pix4D Mapper. And so far, we've done all this in totally free-ranging animals. None of them were sedated for the drone flights or for imaging. But then after the flights, we did want to go back and ground truth the volumetric measurements we were getting from the drones. And we did this with the adult females. We took a suite of morphometric measurements on the ground to reconstruct the animal's body shape as a series of truncated cones, and so measure their total body volume from the ground. This method on the ground does not include the animal's flippers. So we've done a bunch of comparisons here, but the most direct comparison is using the total body volume that we've gotten from the drones, excluding the flippers and the black points on that figure, relative to the total body volume we've estimated from ground morphometrics. And you can see there's a very tight correlation here. And when we look at total body volume from the ground versus the drone method, we get remarkably similar estimates. We were also able to use these volume measurements to estimate true body mass of the seals that we got from weighing the seals. We weighed both the adult females and their pups. And you can see there's a very tight correlation from the linear mixed models for both age classes, with relatively little error. The distribution in error for the adults is within about 5% of body mass. For pups, it's a little bit larger. And the mean absolute error for the pups is about 10% of their body mass. And then we can start applying this. So we wanted to see that the method was sensitive enough to detect those shifts in animal size that we expected to see across lactation. And so we with the drones, weighed anywhere from 1 to 46 seals per group. And we weighed in total almost 700 animals. And across that lactation period in January, we saw the adult females were significantly decreasing their body mass, whereas pups were gaining significant body mass. And there was some difference between the study years as well. Perfect. And then from this, we can start looking at how much the females are losing relative to how much the pups are gaining. So females were losing about 4.5 to 2 liters of body volume per day. And the pups were able to capture a good percentage of that for themselves. So we can start to look at these physiological important proxies that we use. We're looking at populations such as energy transfer efficiency. And the pups were gaining about 45% of that energy transfer for themselves and 60% of that in 2019. So in conclusion, we've developed this non-invasive means of acquiring animal volume and mass estimates for large groups of animals at once. So by using the drones, we're able to get a much larger sample size than would ever be possible on the ground by having to sedate animals or physically weigh them. We also think that this would be a widely applicable method across species and in different habitats as well. The advantage to using this method is that animal volume is a very useful index by itself, instead of just having to use length and develop equations to get that back to something useful. And we think that this would also be a pretty easily adaptable method as well, just changing the specs of your drone and the imaging equipment as well. And
Great.
that's all I have.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Michelle. That was a really great overview of your efforts, and I like the innovative and non-invasive approach to collecting this information. As a reminder, feel free to add any questions for our presenters in the chat box. Our next presenter, Maddie Hayes, will be sharing about using deep learning and drones to automate seabird population counts. Maddie is a research technician at the Duke Marine Robotics and Remote Sensing Lab in Beaufort, North Carolina, or Beaufort. I always get them confused. Beaufort?
Beaufort.
Beaufort. Maddie graduated from the University of Vermont with a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Sciences in 2019, and she has been working with drones for 2 years. After finishing her seabird monitoring project, she is currently working on the use of drones and multispectral imagery to monitor water quality in Beaufort. And I will go ahead, Maddie, and pass the controls to you.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess I'll just jump right in. So this project was a collaboration between the Mars Lab at Duke and the Wildlife Conservation Society down in Argentina. And the motivation for this work was to see if we could utilize high-resolution drone imagery to automate individual counts of black-browed albatrosses and southern rockhopper penguins at key breeding hotspots. So the study site was down in the Jason Islands, which is in northwest Falkland Islands. And the Falkland Islands are home to the world's largest breeding population of black-browed albatrosses and the world's second largest breeding population of southern rockhopper penguins. So we definitely had our work cut out for us. Imagery at sites 1 and 2 on this map was collected in 2018. And then the other 10 sites were flown in 2019, and all of the drone imagery was collected with a DJI Phantom, and the resolution ranged from 0.5 to 5 centimeters per pixel. So to automate bird counts, we use something called a convolutional neural network, which is an important class of deep learning and artificial intelligence. And it consists of elements that kind of work to mimic neurons in the human brain that learn from experience. So these types of models must first be trained on a subset of images with the objects of interest manually labeled. So the convolutional neural network will take in the manually labeled data, and it can learn the visual patterns of, in this case, an albatross or a penguin. And then eventually it can detect birds in unseen images. Oh, sorry. And so we generated separate models for the albatross and penguin detections. So after the drone imagery was collected, it was processed in Pix4D into orthomosaics, and then these orthomosaics were then split into smaller tiles. So a third of the tiles were manually labeled for the albatross model training, and then half of the tiles were manually labeled for the penguin model training. And the penguin model required much more training samples because the penguins are much smaller and they're seen throughout the imagery in different positions like sitting or standing, whereas the albatross are a lot bigger and they're kind of in a uniform pattern across all of the imagery. So after the labeling is done, these tiles are split into training, validation, and testing data, and we used a pre-built deep learning architecture which uses the training data to learn the visual patterns, and then it uses the separate validation data to adjust the model parameters throughout training. And then after that, it uses the unseen testing data to determine the final accuracy of the model. So after all that is said and done, these models were deployed on all of the imagery, and these detections were converted into shapefiles and overlaid on those orthomosaics. So these are just a few examples from the albatross model. So you can see in the lower resolution imagery on the right that it's hard for even the human eye to pick up on some of the albatross. So this is going to be a limitation for the computer as well. And then the two errors in the bottom are in the lowest 5 centimeter per pixel resolution imagery, where the model would typically detect other seabirds or rocks as albatross. And then these are a few outputs from the penguin model. Again, you can see on the right that it's hard for the human eye to pick up on these penguins. And the penguin model would typically pick up on albatross or rocks as penguins, and it missed quite a few penguins throughout the imagery. So overall, the models were able to detect 268,764 black-browed albatrosses. and 68,779 southern rockhopper penguins. The albatross model had a final accuracy of 96%, and the penguin model had a final accuracy of 87%. And for both models, the automated counts were within 5% of the manual counts. And
1 minute remaining.
okay, thank you. So our results also provided really useful considerations for future drone flight planning. So since both models could not detect birds below a certain resolution threshold, and obviously flying lower to the ground may introduce disturbance for more mobile species, we didn't see any significant disturbance even in the highest resolution imagery. So this indicates that we should ideally collect imagery around 1 to 2 centimeter per pixel resolution for any future flights. And although this deep learning method requires significant upfront costs of time spent manually labeling and training the models, I think it took around 40 hours combined. These models can now be applied to future imagery, so it's definitely a feasible option to be integrated with long-term seabird population monitoring at these large mixed colonies like the Jason Islands and beyond. And that's all. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Maddie. That was a great overview of how you guys have utilized drones and the modeling that you guys have put into it. Thank you for sharing those efforts. Our final presentation within this morning's lightning rounds is from Dr. Paula Gillikin and Annie Harshbarger. Together they will be presenting on wild horses' response to drone surveys towards overflights that minimize disturbance. Paula is an environmental scientist who manages 2 state island nature reserves in coastal North Carolina. She also works on advancing solutions for the coast-wide issues of abandoned and derelict vessels and marine debris. Paula earned degrees in environmental science and biology at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington and a master's degree in animals and public policy from Tufts Veterinary School near Boston. Giving the presentation with her today is Annie Harshbarger. Annie is a PhD student studying marine mammal behavioral ecology and conservation at the Duke University Marine Lab. While completing her undergraduate studies at Duke University, Annie worked with the Marine Robotics and Remote Sensing Lab in the North Carolina Coastal Reserve to measure the response of wild horses to drone flights. She has also worked with the NOAA Hawaiian Monk Seal Research Program to assess the response of seals and seabirds to drone flights in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. Before returning to Duke for her graduate studies, she collected sightings and behavior data on large cetaceans in the Gulf of Maine as a research assistant for Allied Whale. I will go ahead and give control over to both Annie and Paula. Thank you.
Hey, great. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. As many of you might be aware, there are several herds of wild horses located along the eastern seaboard of the United States, and 5 of those herds are located in North Carolina. We have several of those herds in Carteret County, North Carolina, and 1 in Beaufort, not Beaufort, but Beaufort, at the Rachel Carson Reserve, which is part of the North Carolina National Estuarine Research Reserve. So that was a perfect study site to test how drone overflights might affect their behavior. So Beaufort, North Carolina is a tourist town. The Rachel Carson Reserve gets lots of visitation that is largely centered on the presence of wild horses. We have the Duke University Marine Lab that is nearby, also the Reserve Office and NOAA. There is a great management need for us to understand how the horses react to drones and visitors and a variety of things. So this was just a perfect study, all the right ingredients in the right place. The state of North Carolina owns the horses, so this was not an issue in permitting. So we had a perfect recipe for a study where we could partner with Duke to try to figure out if there were any behavioral impacts or drone overflights because drones could be very useful in management of the horses, understanding more about their body condition, and getting that data in a much easier way than being on the ground and measuring it on foot. We had seen some evidence of visitors using recreational drones on the reserve to gather footage of wild horses, and we had seen some of those responses of wild horses running, and some of that footage had been posted publicly, and we had some concerns about that. So that was another reason we wanted to conduct the study in a more controlled environment to understand exactly what the reactions were outside of the chasing horses with drones, which was certainly a concern, and this is not something we saw during our study, but it was a concern up front that we wanted to better understand. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Annie to get into the methods.
Thanks, Paula. Okay, so I'm going to take a few moments to give you all an overview of our study design and some of our major findings. So we did 8 flights out on the Rachel Carson Reserve with the help of our talented drone pilot, Rhett Newton, who I believe is listening in today. And we observed the behaviors of the group of horses and a randomly selected focal individual for 30 minutes before each flight to establish a baseline for behavior. For the duration of the flight, which was typically 15 to 20 minutes, and then for 30 minutes after the flight to measure any recovery if there was a response. So we chose 2 altitudes and a flight path that were representative of different monitoring and research activities that we might do on the reserve. So a lower altitude for a low resolution sensor like a thermal camera, or a higher altitude for a higher resolution sensor. And then we flew on parallel track lines in one direction and perpendicular track lines in the other direction, which would be a useful flight path for either estimating populations or doing habitat surveys. So I'm going to start by walking you through the results from just one flight, which was a pretty typical response that we saw, and then we'll look at some overall results. So this figure is the group behaviors of the horses during this flight. And I'll talk about all the altitudes together from now on because there wasn't a big difference between the lower and higher altitude. So on the x-axis is time since we started the observation, and this blue panel is when the drone is in the air. And then the y-axis is the number of horses exhibiting each behavior. So you can see that once the drone is in the air, there are 2 primary behaviors from before the flight of grazing and standing at rest drop off, and then there's a big increase in walking and standing alert. And then our focal individual from this flight matched this pattern very closely. So she was grazing for most of the pre-flight observation period. And then once we launched the drone, she started changing behaviors much more frequently and exhibiting different behaviors than beforehand, including a higher state of vigilance. And then it's not until the very end of this post-flight observation period that she went back to her initial activity, which was grazing. So here is a compilation of our results from all 8 flights, and we've separated them out into flights that occurred around the watering hole and then in other locations on the reserve, because the baseline behaviors are different in these locations. But there's a similar trend. Thank you. Similar trend across both, which is that these sort of low vigilance net energy gain behaviors drop off during the flight, and we see an increase in higher vigilance behaviors. So while we don't perceive this as an immediate risk to the horses, we did see a clear and consistent response, so it's something that we want to keep an eye on moving forward. All right, back to you, Paula.
So where are we going to go in the future with this research now that we know there is a behavioral effect? Well, we don't want to jump right into our monitoring and developing those protocols. We want to understand, well, why is there a reaction? Is it the sight of the drone? Is it the sound of the drone? So we have submitted proposal and are thinking about further studies to articulate this before we really get into the weeds of developing protocols that will be minimally impactful to the horses to help with monitoring and management of these herds. It could be very helpful for other herds, especially western herds that are much more extensive in number than the coastal herds. So we hope that this research can continue with the why question, and we are looking forward to entertaining some of your questions in the question and answer session that is to follow, and we appreciate your interest in the topic.
Thank you, Annie and Paula, so much for that presentation and sharing your experience with using drones and wild horses. We are going to now transition into our Q&A portion of the lightning round. Thank you for those of you who have submitted questions in the chat box, and I do see a lot of the presenters have gone ahead and answered. So thank you very much for that. You are welcome to continue typing into the chat box. I see some more questions coming in. I am going to hit some of these questions, and if presenters you'd like to come off of mute and expand upon them at all, you're welcome to. Milton, I did see a question for you about the survey design of your project and whether you were going to incorporate a random component. And I know that you responded in the chat box that you're looking into sampling other areas and improving the survey design. Do you want to expand upon that?
Yes, Stephanie. Yeah, this is a pilot project, and we want just to see in first place if we were able to see manatees in that area. In particular, Howells Bay have a very turbid water, especially after mid morning. The wind speed increased a lot. But yeah, definitely we want to improve the monitoring, sampling and other areas that we were certainly or know for certainly that the manatees visit. Is far from the boat ramp, but yeah, we want to explore more random samplings, or not. The idea of this monitoring was not exactly assess the population size. But eventually we want to do something related. In this case, we're more just the idea to find how the manatees use that part of the bay, or be sure if they move to that area, because at the beginning we didn't know for sure if they visit that area. We know more that they frequently the east part of the bay, where there are more mangrove canals. And there was another question about the altitude. Usually, I flew about sometimes between 50 to 30 meters, just to scan the general area and try to see if there are animals or organisms in that area. And then I just move sometimes with them, not necessarily at that altitude, but usually I flew something between 45 feet to 33 feet, no lower than that. And usually the idea to do it early in the morning is because even though the manatees were submerged feeding with the clear water, I was able to identify pigment coloration or marks or scars that were one important part of the study.
Great. Thank you, Milton. I appreciate that. I do have a question, and I think it is to any presenter who is willing to come off of mute and respond. John had a question. Has anyone dealt with the probability of detection in these sorts of data? And John, maybe some additional clarification in the chat box might be helpful. Oh.
I'm also going to give some microphone access to a couple of our team experts who are in the participant list right now. So Dave Johnson and Julian, I'm going to give you, and Rhett, if you're still on, so just be aware. And you can activate a mic if you can answer some of these questions too. And Justin.
All right, and I see another question from Joe came in, and it was for Annie and Paula and Dave. Has stealth sound or drone, has a stealth drone been developed or oh my gosh, words, I apologize. Has it been developed or is it under development? And it looks like Dave has responded in the chat box, but Dave, do you want to expand a little bit more upon that?
I mean, I think in general, for commercial purposes, people haven't been developing stealth drones. But we do know that propeller material, like what it's made from, and the configuration of the propeller can alter the sound of the aircraft, probably because they're stiffer. But and a lot of the commercial aircraft that you buy come with plastic propellers that are quite bendy, and that may be one source of noise. And I'm sure Julian can probably provide more details on that, but that's our experience.
Great, thank you, Dave.
The one thing that we've found as well is that the different types of aircraft as well, the motor RPM obviously creates a propeller noise at a different frequency. So a lot of the bigger aircraft with slower spinning motors and larger propellers, which are actually more efficient, are also a much lower frequency, for a given size. So that depending on the study species and their kind of hearing thresholds, that might be a consideration as well for the audible side of it. But as Dave pointed out, particularly the propeller design, there is some work being done to kind of improve the efficiency of the propellers, which should improve the noise characteristics as well. But particularly a lot of it is just the material, and in our experience, the kind of thinner carbon fiber blades tend to be higher performance and with a lower noise profile.
Thank you for sharing that. It also looks like John has shared in the chat box that their Mavic Platinum Pro makes less noise than their Phantom 4, probably because of the better propeller design and a lighter aircraft. Alrighty. Any other questions that we might have for our presenters this morning?
Caitlin, I believe that early on there was a question about using drones for sea turtle studies. And I know that Dave Johnston put one response in the chat. I'm not sure if others did, but maybe that's something that if other folks who are in our participant list, if you have information to share related to that, maybe you could put it in the chat. And John Quinlan had mentioned that there are some good studies out there from USGS that may be pertinent to some of the things we're hearing about today. I put a link to some of his publications in the chat here. That was Andy Royal with USGS. So feel free to check those out. They're not all related to today's
Absolutely.
topic,
and
but
I also just saw that Dave
a number of them
shared an article about details on recording drone sounds. I'll give a few more moments for folks who are typing into the chat box.
And thanks, John Quinlan, for that clarification.
A lot of great resource sharing in the chat box. Thank you all. Dave has also shared an article with work on detecting probability of sharks. And we do have a question from Gary. Has anyone in the U.S. dealt with MMPA issues while working with other coastal species? He's specifically thinking about the bottlenose dolphin while doing turtle or bird work. Are there any good best practices or protocols that we can send or direct? And presenters, if you guys have any resources that you have found helpful in your efforts, that would be wonderful to share.
I do. The on the website,
like,
there's
Dave,
a couple of
you've raised your hand, so you have
resources
something to
that are
add there.
directly focused on that. One of them is a paper that was just recently published that focuses on operational protocols for marine animals, ranging from jellyfish all the way up to whales. And so there's a lot of good information in there. It's it's really a first run at developing these kinds of best practices operationally for marine animals. And then there's also a resource there for sort of reporting in publication. So how do you take the drone components that kind of tend to overwhelm a paper and create a repeatable supplement that you can submit with your paper instead of putting everything in the main text. We've dealt a lot with the MMPA about flying over marine mammals. We do that a lot of places, and there's a much more streamlined process now to be able to get permits to be able to do that. And I'm happy to talk more about that and share our permitting type stuff with anyone who's interested, should they need it.
Thank you, Dave. And Abby has posted the workshop website in the chat box if anybody would like to refer to those resources that Dave was just sharing about.
And Gary, this is Steph Robinson. From having to do the NEPA work on our National Estuarine Research Reserve awards, I have some contacts with NIMS and U.S. Fish and Wildlife that I can send to you here in the region. I can try to pull some of the concurrence information that I've gotten on those that gives some of their best practices. It's a little disconcerting that neither agency has like a web page you can go to and pull those. So I'm glad that Dave also has some papers he can point to.
Great, thank you, Steph. Alrighty, well, if you see or think of any questions throughout the rest of today's session, please feel free to type them into the chat box. If you asked a question earlier, our presenters are on top of it and have been responding to questions in the chat box over the past series of presentations. Thank you to all of our presenters for wonderful presentations. These projects really opened my eyes to the opportunities that drones can provide to monitoring wildlife species. And I am excited to continue learning more about these projects and drone use. And thank you to everyone who participated in the chat box with questions and answers and resources. It really was a great opportunity to engage with everybody. We are going to take about a 10-minute break, and we will have a timer on your screen that'll give you a countdown. There that is. When we come back from our break, we are going to move into some breakout room discussions and really dive into different efforts, gaps, challenges, technology, and overall goals that you guys might have as a group for using drones to conduct species and wildlife management. And we'll go over our breakout room guidelines when you guys come back from the break. So we will see everybody back at 11:05.
Could please remute your microphones?
I am. Thank you so much.
I hope you had some great
welcome back,
discussions
everybody.
in the breakout session.
I know in our breakout room we had a
Caitlin,
lot of
are
great
you back with
discussion
us?
about how technology could be improved. We have a lot of great ideas on the ideal drone for drone use with wildlife and species monitoring. So if there are any drone companies out there, we've got a good list for them to get going with. As a reminder, the notes from our breakout rooms that we were just in will be projected at the end of the meeting today for anyone who's interested in viewing them. And the breakout group notes will also be in the final meeting report, and that will also be shared on the workshop website. Before we wrap up for today, I do want to introduce Dr. Chris Taylor with NOAA to join us and help summarize all that we have learned throughout this Drones in the Coastal Zone workshop the past several weeks, and share more about what is going to be coming up.
Thanks so much, Caitlin, and great job moderating and facilitating today's session. These were really great talks. I think we had the highest attendance on this session. I think this speaks to the broad interest in species and wildlife management across our region, both in the Southeastern Caribbean. I'm particularly impressed with the number of partners that we had join us from the Caribbean through this workshop, and I think that was one of the advantages that we saw in being able to, or sometimes being forced to, reformat this session and this workshop from what was going to be an in-person workshop in Beaufort, North Carolina, to this virtual workshop. And I hope we were able to reformat it in an effective way so that we could teach you something and learn something from you, to exchange ideas and best practices. And I just want to share here a couple of the really high-level take-home points, because we've been feverishly taking notes in the background throughout all of these sessions from day one through this sixth day, as well as capturing all the notes from the great contributions in the breakouts. And we will be preparing a workshop report that will summarize all of these activities and all these great ideas. And I think what we've learned is, I hope everyone has learned, that we have a very diverse set of coastal management drivers in the Southeastern Caribbean. Some are very common, and some are very specific to where we are all working, whether it be North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Puerto Rico, or the Virgin Islands. And what I've been impressed by is that we already have a broad base. We have really impressive expertise across the field of drones and across a variety of disciplines. And I think what we wanted to develop here was that framework for that community of expertise and the community of practice. And I think we came to understand that many of the drone users, that whether they have a specific interest in wildlife's management or in habitat condition or in, say, damage assessment, are clearly able to learn from their counterparts that may be in a very different discipline. And it's because of the common issues and sometimes challenges that we have with applying drones in these coastal applications. I think one of the things we've learned here is that navigating the drone regulations and policies can be complicated and maybe daunting and overwhelming to the newcomers. But I hope you came to understand that there are experts within this field that are willing to share their practices, and that can be from NOAA, our agency, or understanding the very different restrictions that may be within state regulations and policies, or even within your local municipality. I think we have representatives from all those entities across our region here, so that we hope that this has become less complicated and less daunting, less overwhelming, and that we have shared with you the resources and the context to help overcome some of these challenges as you consider entering a drone program into your coastal application. We've also understood, and we've walked through in many cases, and thanks to the Duke Lab for providing some very thoughtful considerations for how we need to define our objectives, how we need to understand the importance of mission planning from the very beginning of those mission objectives to the very end, and how we need to include things like data management considerations, because considering all of those things, along with the regulatory and policy, are going to surely increase the chances of success in your project. In addition to that, I'm recalling of many feedback loops, a lot of arrows pointing back to previous steps, so that when you come into a challenge, that you're able to make changes and alterations that help you improve on the process and achieve that success. I can't remember, there was a phrase, I'm going to have to look back in the notes, but I'm going to capture all these as text boxes. I know Justin had a few of them talking about some of the less successful outings that were had there, and I think those phrases are in the notes. And I think what we came to understand, and I think we knew this when we were developing the framework for this workshop, is that this discussion that we had here is just the beginning. We think that there's a lot to be gained from continuing this dialogue across agencies, across academia, and including the industry. We think that a regional drone network could foster these collaborations for new projects and to address management needs and data gaps. We could continue to establish and refine best practices, particularly for data sharing or operational procedural sharing. And more importantly, I think some of us are more in tune with the latest, greatest technology, and continuing to raise awareness of these new technologies, techniques, and procedures is always interesting to folks. We've seen a lot of exposure to deep learning and machine learning methods for processing these very complicated and very large data sets, and I think that's only going to continue to grow rapidly, and will benefit from continuing these dialogues across our partnership in this workshop. I think I want to open it up there, from there to, if it's possible, to open up the discussion through the chat window. And then I'd like to get some more input on what a regional drone network may look like. The first step, I think, is that we would like to develop or form a development team that would allow us to define the scope of activities for a regional drone network. We're calling this a regional drone network, so I think we're going to define it by the geography that we're speaking to here, North Carolina through Florida and the U.S. Caribbean. And I know Dave Johnson is aware of, and us know as well, that there are opportunities for proposals, RFPs, that could be written to compete for some funding that would support the development of this network. And so I guess to begin this discussion, it'd be useful to maybe get some additional ideas of what we think the drone network would provide. What are some of the benefits that you'd see by forming a formal network across the region? thanks for that comment. Are there other regional drone networks? And I think we saw a great example. I was particularly impressed with Skyduck. First of all, it's one of the coolest acronyms in our region. I really appreciated Evan Cook's summary of their approaches. It seems like sharing in best practices and data sharing were some of their primary goals, and they did it it seemed daunting and overwhelming, but they were able to tackle it in a way that I think made very significant headway in how you would establish so that data sharing and best practice sharing. One of the avenues is to grow and build upon the Skyduck model and do it at a regional level.
Yeah, Chris, that is a great summary, and I have really valued being able
Chris,
to connect with you and all the people that have been involved in these seminars. And one of the biggest things that I think about now is the concept of interoperability and the requirements that we need to make sure that folks that are working with drones in different locations are following sets of standards and best practices that will allow that stuff to be compared across regions. And right now, we don't have that. If you compare it to a traditional remote sensing system like Landsat, every Landsat mission has a set of Landsat scientists that define, how the data can be worked with. And what we're looking at is a bunch of different sensors being deployed in different locations, and we don't have a lot of coordination or standards for everybody to be able to kind of build into their work so that it's comparable. And so scientifically, we really need that. It doesn't need to happen just regionally, but it really is a requirement for us to move this, move the needle on how we use drones in this way. So I wanted to make sure that this idea of interoperability across the region is a real key factor that needs to be addressed.
Thanks for that, Dave. It's a great comment. I'm scrolling up through the chat window. Steph, do you see any other comments that I might have missed? I guess I will say out loud, Alex's comment here is well taken. It's collaborating in order to share resources. Sometimes these drones can be very expensive. The licenses can be expensive. The data processing tools the software may not be expensive, but the expertise may be expensive. And I think finding ways to collaborate in order to leverage those assets and resources is really important.
Yes, and as I entered in the chat there, we have talked about this within the NEARS of the Southeastern Caribbean region, but not beyond that. So definitely an interesting idea. Good idea. It looks like we have some more folks typing. Chris and others, feel free to continue the discussion. I'm just going to bring up our exit polls while we're continuing the conversation. And I will point out that these are the exit polls for this particular session. One of them, the comment one, is about potential future sessions. Thank you, Gary, for putting the REAL acronym in there. I was summarizing what Skyduck is. We are going to be sending out an overall evaluation for the entire workshop series. So please be on the lookout for that. It actually will automatically open for you at the end of today's session, but you'll also be getting it in email. So if you don't have time to do it today, we really do
amplify John Shallow's comment here. Yes, I think a regional network like this, it's important to understand what other regions may be developing these networks and what professional societies we can leverage to. I know ASPERS, there's various organizations, remote sensing groups that are growing the uncrewed systems, uncrewed air systems, and helping to develop those technologies. I think it's very important that we reach out to them to help develop this framework. And Evan, thanks for the link. I hope that someone won an award for that acronym.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of get people to think a little bit about,
Dave,
this idea of having a regional network, but possibly, thinking about that as a hierarchical approach where there's nodes within that. And I think there are lots of ways that a regional network would be able to facilitate better collaboration and increased funding for what we do, and better management of coastal resources. But I think there are some political things that could be addressed best at the state level in terms of regulatory things. And so there may be a really nice model that builds on the Skyduck model, where we have possibly state-based regional nodes under an umbrella framework that essentially do the different things, right? That regional thing is looking after people across the broader context, whereas these local things can meet more frequently, address the local context better, and help organize input into the larger regional model. So I just wanted to make sure that people were thinking about this not just as one organization, but potentially kind of an alliance of groups that function differently, but together.
Absolutely, and I think that is a perfect summary for all of the efforts that are happening here within this workshop series. And with that, I do want to take the moment to say thank you to all of our presenters throughout today's webinar series and all the previous webinar series. The notes from all of the breakout groups are up on your screens now. You are welcome to read through them to see discussions that happened in other groups, and share any comments that you have about those discussions in the chat box. And those will be up for about 15 minutes. And thank you all for joining us today. And any other closing comments from anybody on the project team?
No, this is Steph. Just didn't want to cut off the conversation. If folks are interested in wanting to stay on, you're welcome to stay on and continue the conversation, as well as scrolling through the breakout notes. We can't add to the breakout notes, as Caitlin may have mentioned, so if you have something to add there, please do so in the chat.
No, I just wanted to say thanks to all of our facilitators, moderators, and especially to Whitney, to Kristen, and to Stephanie for
and I'm sorry, Chris,
keeping these balls rolling. I know having 6 sessions through the web, through the Adobe, and with all the potentials for technical issues, we had very, very few of them, and I thought it was a very well-run venue, and I appreciate your efforts on this, Steph and Kristen.
Happy to do it. This has been a great experience, I think.
Oh, yes, and definitely thanks to Abby for handling all the email traffic and helping to reformat this workshop into the virtual session. We had a significant and overwhelming response, and I'm pleased at the number of people that were able to join for each of our sessions. It was great to meet and learn from everybody.
So not to take away from the love fest for the project team that's going on in the chat right now. Definitely feeling that from everybody. Thank you so much. But if you do have additional thoughts about a regional consortium or team of some sort, please do put those in the chat as well, or as we get down to a more manageable number of folks, if there are folks who want to stay on and talk about that, I'll be happy to give folks microphone access as well.
No, thanks for that, John. Yeah, I think
Chris, seeing John Quinlan's
that's
comment in
some
the
of the
chat,
goals that we would probably
wanna,
achieve with this regional drone network. We've
or...
hopefully started to achieve with the Southeast Acoustics Consortium. So bringing people together to share their stories, and then having very informal gatherings to talk about best practices, latest, greatest technology. We've developed some significant collaborations through those gatherings. I think maybe that may be some of the aspects that we've lost with this virtual interaction, is to have that in-person, face-to-face, and I still hope that sometime next year we'll be able to host smaller in-person gatherings for hands-on demonstrations, hands-on training. I think that would get us very far. So thanks for your comment, John.